We left off last video getting our appetizer detail view UI built. Now let's connect it to our list view. So if you go to appetizer list view, let's talk about how we're going to do this. Okay, our preview, let's just get rid of the preview because we're just gonna be looking at the loading screen the whole time. So I'll buy some screen real estate. So thinking about how we're gonna do this, right? We wanna tap the list row, right? The appetizer list cell, we wanna basically add a way to tap. If you're familiar with UIKit, we're basically implementing the same thing of like did select item at index path. However, we don't have index paths, we don't have table view delegates. It's much simpler than that in Swift UI. We do on our cell, right? Not on the list, like on the actual cell itself, because we want to know like which one we tapped. We can do it modifier on tap gesture, and then we get the code here. And what we want to do here is one, display the detail view that we have, but we also need to pass data, right? We need to pass whatever appetizer we tapped into that detail view. Okay, so we're gonna need a variable for the selected appetizer, and we're gonna need, a state variable like is showing detail, right? Back to the whole reactive programming declarative, right? We need to flip is showing detail, and that's what determines if the detail view is showing. So let's do this one at a time. Let's first get our detail view showing. Okay, so here we're gonna create at state private var is showing detail. It's gonna equal false by default. And when we do the refactor in the next video, we're gonna move this into the view model. Again, I like to get it working here first and then refactor. Okay, so on tap, we wanna flip that to true. So is showing detail equals true. Okay, so we're changing the data, but like nothing's listening to that data yet. Well, let's create that. And very, very similar to what we did with our loading view, right? Like remember a couple videos back, like if we're loading, hey, slap the loading view on top of the Z stack that we created. Well, our detail view is also gonna go in the Z stack. However, it's above the list view. Like as you see in the design, we have the list view in the background with the detail view on top, but it's not above the loading view. So it's in between them. So again, very similar concept to the loading, right? If is showing detail, then we'll show the detail view. So appetizer detail view all the way at the bottom, initialize a new one. We're gonna have to initialize that with an appetizer. For now, we're gonna initialize it with the sample that we're using, right? The mock data run. We're gonna eventually switch that out, but just to get this first part working, let's try this. Mock data.sample appetizer. Cool. Okay, so now let's run the app and try this. So again, we put a tap gesture on the cell. When the cell is tapped, we're flipping our is showing detail, to true or false. And because we're watching that is showing detail, because it's a state variable, we're going to redraw. And then if is showing detail is true, then we're actually going to initialize the detail view and show it, in theory. Run it, see what we got here. Okay, let's tap on, let's just pick one, right? Let's pick meatballs. Okay, well, it didn't matter what we picked because we're not passing the data yet. All we were testing was to make sure we got our detail view showing up when we tapped the cell, and we did. Okay, so now the next thing we want to do, actually while we're here, because right now, like I'm just tapping dismiss and nothing's happening. So let's get that part working again before we start passing the data. So we're just going to get the structure of the UI working first. If you remember, it's the same thing as the framework detail view that we did before. So we're going to need a binding to is showing detail in our appetizer detail view, right? Because when we tap the X on our appetizer detail view, we want to flip is showing detail to false. So this redraws and then hides the appetizer detail view. Okay, so on the appetizer detail view, another property, we need at binding var is showing detail, right? And that is a bool. Okay, if I do a command B, Xcode is going to yell at me because now I have to initialize my appetizer view with the binding. So back to the appetizer list view, do command B because I want Xcode to yell at me right here. Cool, missing argument and parameter, right? It's saying, hey, you said I had a binding, you're not giving it to me. So is showing detail, we want to pass a binding to is showing detail. And again, I know I'm repeating myself, but really driving this home. That is a binding to this state var here, right? So think of a binding as almost like a reference, between views. And then again, I'm going to put the parameters down here for ease of reading. Okay, so now that my detail view has this Boolean, I need to flip this Boolean accordingly. And where I want to flip this Boolean is in my overlay down at the bottom that we created. Oh, the previews. How many times I'm telling you, you're going to be so annoyed with these previews. So again, we want to, for the previews, we can do .constant and then just give it, a value, true. And then for ease of reading, cool. Okay, so anyway, back to our overlay button, right? Remember the circle with the X button? Well, here, instead of just printing dismiss, which you can see in the console as I was tapping it, now we want to do is showing detail equals false. And again, that will change this binding, which is a binding, or if you want to think about it as a reference, to this is showing detail. It'll flip that, it'll redraw the view, and then we will not be showing the appetizer detail view. Let's test it out. Cool. Click on chicken dumplings. There it is. Again, we got more work to do with the UI, but hey, it's showing up. Hit the X, it dismisses. Great. The basics are done. Tap on another one. Cool. There it is. Now, again, before we pass data, let's set up our background blur. Because again, looking at the design, right, it's a nice blurry background on top. You can see the shadow making it pop. Back to what we have, right, this doesn't look great. Not to mention it doesn't look great, but look, I can scroll behind. You don't want that. And I can like even tap something else. I mean, you can't, it does pull up another detail view. You can't see it, but it messes up our UI like all the time by like being able to scroll behind that. Okay, so let's handle the blur, and then we're also going to disable the list so you can't interact with the list while the detail screen is showing. All right, so let's do the blur first. So on the navigation view, right, that's what I want to do this on. I don't want to blur out everything else, just the list essentially. So under on appear, I want to do dot blur. Pretty straightforward. This was a lot more complicated in UIKit. And then we want to give it a radius. I want to give it a blur radius of 20. However, not all the time, right? Because if I run this, that's not what we want, right? We don't want it on all the time. We only want to show the blur when is showing detail is true. So we can use the ternary operator here. So is showing detail, ternary operator, when it's true, be 20. When we're not showing detail, be 0. So let's run this real quick. So our blur should be gone because is showing detail is false. Cool. Blur is gone. Now let's tap an item. Cool. Blur is there, right? That's the look we're going for. Now you can see I can still scroll in the background, right? That's not what we want. Bad behavior, not what we want. So now that the blur is handled, let's disable the list using the same logic here that we only want to disable it when is showing detail is true. So disabling a view is quite simple as well. And we want to disable our list. So below the navigation title here, which is our list modifiers, type dot disabled, right? And now we need to pass in a Boolean. Well, what Boolean do we want to pass in is showing detail. So is showing detail. And what this will do is, if is showing detail is true, disabled will be true. If is showing detail is false, disabled will be false, which is the behavior we want. Let's run it and test it out. Again, you want to be testing like step by step. So like if you have a bug, like what broke it. Okay, now look, now I can't scroll on the back. So that is the behavior we are looking for. The only thing we are missing here is actually showing the correct data here. So let's stop running this and let's talk about that. At the beginning of the video, I said we're going to need two things, right? We're going to need the variable for is showing detail. We've handled that. Now we're going to need how do we track the selected item, right? What appetizer was selected? We need to track that somewhere because we need to pass that into our detail view. Right, and we have that appetizer locally, but only locally like on our list, right? We don't have access to it outside of that scope into our detail view. So we need to create a variable that holds that. And it needs to be state, because again, we want to hold state. We don't want it to, revert back to no value. When our view gets destroyed and recreated, we want to hold state here. So state private var, you can say selected appetizer, and that is of type appetizer. It's going to be an optional because right now there is no selected appetizer in the beginning. So now what we can do in the tap gesture, we can set the selected appetizer to whatever appetizer was tapped, right? We have access to that locally. So we can do selected appetizer equals appetizer. So now that we have a value in our selected appetizer, now we need to pass that selected appetizer into our appetizer detail view. So just pass in selected appetizer. It's an optional. We'll force unwrap it for now. Now let's test this. Hit play. And we're going to see it half working, okay? And see if you can think about why it will be half working. You may not know. It's because the image, watch the image no matter what I type or tap. So I tap meatballs, cool. I get the meatballs title, the meatballs description, all the stuff about the meatballs, just not the image. The reason being is because we never set that up. Remember, we just used our dummy image. So let's close this, go back to our appetizer detail view. And instead of just using the image, which we hard-coded to Asian flank steak, right? Well, now we can do our appetizer remote image that we created a couple videos ago, right? And the URL string is going to be appetizer.image URL. And then again, because we're already using resizable within the remote image, we can delete that, do a Command B, we should be good to go. Now, the way we have this set up, like you may be thinking, oh man, we got to download this again when we tap it. But if you think about how we have this set up on downloading the images, remember, we're putting them in the cache with the image URL as the identifier. So what's going to happen, I'll walk through this. Well, let's make sure we have it working before I explain it. So let's tap on chicken avocado spring roll. Cool. There's our chicken avocado spring roll. There's the long title, description, everything seems to be working. But what's going on here is when I tap this item here, right, I'm not actually downloading the image again. And that's because we put it in the cache. Back to our network manager, right, what happens here is it's going to go into download image, but the first step of download image is to pull it from the cache if we have it. And because we've already downloaded them the first time on the list, they're pretty much always going to be in the cache when we go to the detail screen. And if for some reason it's not, okay, we'll download it again. But that should never happen. Famous last words of the developer. That should never happen. We're good. We're safe. So anyway, that is our detail view, connected, up and running, working. Again, just the basics of it. So cool, looking good. And then in the next video, we're going to go back to our appetizer detail view and clean this up a little bit. And then in our appetizer list view, right, we should have these on our view model, not in our view. But again, I wanted to get it working and then refactor. So let's do it.